Eastern Montana had seen bad winters before, but the winter that caught the high plains in the early 1920s felt different from the start. You could taste it in the air, sharp, metallic, heavy, in a way old-timers recognized, but didn't talk about. When people who had lived through 40 winters go quiet, you pay attention. Out on the edge of Carter County, 58-year-old Elias Halverson watched the first cold front roll over the Bear Paw Mountains and understood one thing: this was going to be the kind of winter that punished mistakes, while his neighbors patched gaps in their cabins and stacked firewood higher than their roofs. Elias was doing something no one could understand. Instead of reinforcing the log walls on his small homestead cabin, he was tearing them off. In their place, he began assembling what looked to everyone driving past like a crude double-walled hut made of sod blocks and tightly packed grass. They slowed their horses or trucks, stared, shook their heads, and kept going. A few laughed. A few said he'd finally snapped. One man asked why he'd waste time on something that clearly belonged in the 1800s. Elias didn't bother defending himself. He wasn't building a monument or proving a point. He was building something that might keep him alive. He had seen this kind of cold break men before men with better tools, bigger barns, more livestock, and more help. The truth he never said out loud was simple. Winter doesn't care about your reputation. It cares whether your walls hold heat when everything outside steals it. And Elias planned to make sure his walls did exactly that. Elias didn't invent the idea he was building. He wasn't trying to be clever or original. What he was doing came from a memory he had carried since childhood, one of the few pieces of knowledge his father had passed down before the family left Norway in 1909. Back then, winter wasn't just a season. It was a force that shaped everything: how people built, how they stored food, even how they breathed inside their own homes. His father used to say, "Cold doesn't kill you first, the wind does." Elias never forgot that. He remembered watching older men in the fjords build shelters with thick sod-packed grass and a strange double-wall system that always confused him as a boy. They weren't pretty, and no one bragged about them, but those walls held heat better than the newer boards people were switching to. The men called them breathing walls, simple structures built from whatever the land gave them. But they worked even during the storms that sent fishing families into the mountains for safety. Now, decades later, standing on the open Montana prairie, Elias recognized the same warning signs his father once taught him: sharp drops in pressure, early hard frost, and that heavy stillness in the air. He didn't know if the winter would last weeks or months. He only knew one thing: whatever was coming, a normal log cabin wouldn't hold heat long enough to protect him. So he wasn't copying the past. He was repeating something that had already been tested in a place colder, harsher, and more unforgiving than anything Montana could offer. And this time he wasn't building it for a fishing family. He was building it for himself. By the second week of construction, word had already spread across the small ranching community. Folks out here didn't miss much. If a man changed the way he trimmed his fence posts, someone noticed. So when Elias started stacking sod blocks and grass bales into a round double-walled shape, people talked. Some talked kindly, saying, maybe the old Norwegian just liked doing things his own way. Others weren't so gentle. A couple of neighbors rode by, slow, leaned on their saddle horns, and asked if he needed help, though the tone made it clear they didn't mean the offer. One younger rancher laughed under his breath and said, "Looks like a bad root cellar someone forgot to finish." Another shook his head and muttered, "Man gets old, starts doing strange things." Elias never argued. He never explained. If people didn't believe him, a speech wouldn't change that. And if he was wrong, he'd learn soon enough without embarrassing anyone else. Silence was easier. The only opinion that truly bothered him came from his son, Andrew. Back from the Great War, Andrew was a practical man. He believed in new ideas, better tools, and proven systems. Watching his father build what looked like a low, rounded bunker made of dirt and dried grass just didn't make sense to him. "Pa, we have lumber. We have a stove that works. Why not reinforce what we already have?" Elias didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the horizon the way men do when they're thinking years back instead of moments ahead. "Because what's coming isn't a normal winter," he said quietly, "and a normal cabin won't be enough." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The structure really started taking shape when Elias began setting the second wall. That was the moment people stopped calling it a weird hut and started calling it flat out strange. Most ranchers built one solid wall, straight logs, tight, chinking maybe tar paper if they wanted to get fancy. Two walls with a deliberate gap in between. That sounded like wasted work and wasted time. But Elias kept going. He built the inner wall, first thick sod blocks stacked tight, each one cut from the prairie with a spade he'd carried since his first year in Montana. Sod has weight to it, density you don't notice until you carry it. It holds moisture, slows airflow, and behaves more like stone than dirt. Elias knew that. Then he built the outer wall made from grass bales and packed soil. Not pretty, not perfect, but strong enough to stand on its own. The important part, the part everyone thought proved he'd lost his mind, was the space between them, a consistent 12 to 14 inches of open air. Andrew watched him measure that gap over and over. "Why leave it hollow? Isn't that where heat escapes?" Elias shook his head. "Heat escapes when air moves. You trap air, you trap warmth." Andrew frowned. "So it's insulation." "In a way," Elias said. "A wall the winter wind can't squeeze through." Most neighbors assumed the gap would fill with snow or collapse in the first storm. But what they didn't understand was this still air is one of the best insulators nature ever made. Back in Norway, men used it long before fiberglass or foam existed. They didn't know the science, they just knew it kept their families alive. Elias was counting on it to do the same for him now. Andrew tried to stay patient, but every day the structure grew, the more confused he became. He respected his father. Elias had survived things most men never faced: failed crops, broken winters, long stretches of loneliness on the prairie. But this project tested Andrew in a different way. He couldn't see the logic, and he didn't like feeling that gap between them. One evening, after hauling water and feeding the horses, Andrew stood beside the rising dome-shaped cabin and finally said what he'd been holding back. "Pa, this doesn't look safe. It's low, it's heavy, and it's strange. A straight wall is easier to repair. A roof should be peaked, not rounded. And what happens when this thing freezes solid?" Elias didn't snap. He rarely did. He wiped the dirt from his hands and looked at the curved structure the way a craftsman studies a nearly finished piece of work. "A straight wall fights the wind," he said. "A round wall lets it go around and keep moving." Andrew shook his head. "That sounds like something from a story, not a building plan." Elias pointed toward the north ridge where early snow was already forming thin lines on the rock. "Stories come from somewhere. Men before us figured out what worked by staying alive long enough to teach it." Andrew didn't know how to answer that. He'd seen engineering in France during the war, bridges, barracks, hospitals. Everything had angles, beams, calculations. Nothing looked like this. Still, he could feel winter tightening its grip. He could feel the tension in the air. "Pa," he said finally, "what if you're wrong?" Elias didn't hesitate. "Then we freeze, and freezing teaches fast." There wasn't much left to argue after that. By the time Elias started shaping the roofline, the structure no longer looked like anything people around Carter County recognized. Most homes stood tall and square. Even line shacks had straight walls and pointed roofs. But Elias kept his building low-rounded and almost crouched toward the earth. It didn't look strong. It didn't look modern. It looked old. And that was exactly the point. He layered the upper courses in a slow inward curve, each block overlapping the one below it, by just enough to start forming a natural dome. Andrew stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the shape tighten. "You know the ridge winds hit from the west," Andrew said. "A flat roof lets snow slide off. This curve might just trap it." Elias nodded. "Let it. That's supposed to be reassuring." "Snow insulates," Elias said plainly. "A peaked roof loses heat. A dome keeps it in." It wasn't theory to him. He'd watched fishermen in Norway build rounded shelters that stayed warm long after the fire burned out. A dome had no corners for wind to dig into. It had no weak spot for uplift. Everything pressed downward, locking the structure into itself. Andrew tried to picture it the way his father saw it, but all he could see was a heavy roof and early snowfall, combining into a dangerous load. "Seems risky," he muttered. "Everything in winter is risky," Elias replied. "I'm choosing the risk that gives something back." He tapped the inside of the dome, where the curve began tightening. Heat rises. A tall roof wastes it. This roof keeps it close. Simple words, direct, practical. Andrew exhaled, finally understanding the heart of it, not the history, not the tradition, but the logic. This wasn't a monument. It was a heat trap built to outsmart cold itself. As the structure grew, Elias gathered the materials most ranchers ignored. Sod blocks cut from the prairie-dried grass bales, from summer haying and buckets of compacted soil. None of it looked impressive. It didn't shine like new lumber or carry the confidence of milled boards. But Elias trusted these materials for one simple reason: they behaved the same in extreme cold as they did in mild weather. No shrinking, no cracking, no sudden gaps for wind to find. He explained it to Andrew in plain terms. "Sod is dense," he said, lifting a block with both hands. "It holds its shape, it slows the cold down. It's like stacking thousands of little earth bricks." Andrew pressed the side of a grass bale, surprised by how firm it felt. "And this insulation, light but tight, traps heat, breathes just enough to manage moisture." Soil went between layers to fill micro gaps the eye couldn't see. Not mortar, just extra mass, extra weight, extra resistance. When neighbors rode by, they shrugged at the pile of dirt and grass and assumed Elias had lost all ambition. In their minds, real homes were built from beams and saw-cut boards. This looked temporary, primitive, even fragile. But Elias only cared about performance. A sod wall had thermal inertia. Once it warmed, it stayed warm longer. Grass bales had millions of tiny air pockets that slowed heat loss the same way modern insulation does today. And soil simply refused to let wind pass through it. Together, the three materials worked like layers of armor: mass, air, fiber, each doing a job no single material could do alone. Andrew finally said, "It's not pretty." Elias answered, "Pretty won't keep a man alive in January." He wasn't joking. By late November, the sky changed. The air felt heavier, colder, and slower. Old-timers around Carter County said the same thing in different ways. "Feels like a long one coming." Even Andrew, who tried not to believe in instincts, caught himself checking the horizon more often. When the first storm rolled in, it didn't come with drama. It came quietly, the way serious weather often does. Snow fell in a soft, steady curtain. No wind at first, just a slow white layering that covered fence lines, horses, and the half-finished chores of the day. Temperatures dropped to the teens overnight, and ranchers rushed to reinforce their cabins and barns. Most expected the usual: a few cold days, then a break. But this storm didn't break. It thickened. Inside Elias's dome, the temperature stayed surprisingly steady. Even without a fire going, the interior held between 18 and 22 degrees. Fahrenheit cold but livable, especially compared to the drafty log cabins nearby. Andrew kept checking the thermometer his father had hung near the entrance, shaking his head every time he saw the numbers. "How is this place warmer without heat?" he finally asked. Elias pointed to the walls. Sod slowed the cold. Grass trapped the warmth. Air gap stopped the wind. Andrew pressed his hand to the inner wall. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing either. More like a steady, neutral, cool proof that the mass of the structure wasn't losing heat as quickly as everything else around them. Outside, cabins creaked, doors rattled, even barns with good lumber started to show gaps where cold air clawed its way inside. Inside Elias's dome, nothing moved. No drafts, no groaning timbers, just a quiet, steady calm. The storm wasn't over, it was only getting started. But the dome had already passed its first test. 3 days into the cold snap, Andrew noticed something strange. Inside their dome, there was no frost forming along the walls, no wet patches, no icy corners. In the cabins he grew up in, frost was normal, thick crystals, creeping along the log joints whenever the temperature dropped hard. But here, even as the outside thermometer hit single digits, the inside walls stayed dry. It bothered him enough to ask, "Pa, why isn't anything freezing in here? We're not running a stove. We're breathing, cooking, living. Shouldn't moisture be building up?" Elias brushed his hand across the inner wall. "The wall handles it." "What does that mean?" "It absorbs during the day, releases at night." Simple words, but they carried weight. Back in Norway, the old fishermen and farmers didn't use the term moisture buffering, but they understood it. Sod and grass could take in water vapor when the air grew too humid, then slowly let it go once temperatures shifted. It prevented condensation, mold, frost, and rot, things that ruined cabins made of tight-fitted lumber. Andrew frowned. "So the wall breathes. Enough to help us, not enough to lose heat." Most ranchers built tight log walls thinking airtight meant warm, but airtight also meant moisture trapped inside. When the temperature dropped below, freezing trapped moisture turned to frost, frost expanded, and walls weakened. Stoves had to work twice as hard. The air felt damp and cold no matter how much wood you burned. Elias had built the opposite, a controlled exchange. Not drafts, not leaks, just slow, steady balancing. "That's why it feels different in here," Andrew said quietly. "Dry air feels warmer." Elias nodded. "Moisture is heat, son. Handle it wrong, you lose both." This wasn't superstition. It was physics learned the hard way by people who didn't have the luxury of getting it wrong. The real storm didn't arrive with a warning. It hit like someone had dropped a wall of cold straight out of the northern sky. Temperatures plunged from 0 to 25 in less than 20 hours. Wind pushed in from the west at 30 miles per hour, then climbed to 40. Snow didn't drift so much as it blasted sideways, stinging any exposed skin like grit from a belt sander. Every cabin in the county felt it. Doors shook in their frames. Window edges hissed as thin streams of cold air slipped through. Wood shrank and cracked with sharp, quick pops that echoed through the night. Horses stood with their tails to the wind heads down, waiting it out. Even ranchers who'd lived their whole lives on the plains said they'd never seen cold settle so fast or so deep. Inside Elias's dome, the situation looked completely different. Andrew checked the thermometer hung beside the entryway every few hours, expecting it to fall sharply. Instead, the needle held steady, 28 to 31 degrees, barely below freezing, warm enough to work, warm enough to sleep, warm enough to stay human. "What is keeping this place from dropping?" Andrew asked on the fourth night when the wind screamed so loud outside it sounded like the sky was tearing. Elias pointed upward, mass, curve, still air. He didn't say it for effect. He said it because those were the only pieces that mattered. The sod walls held the cold back by sheer density. The grass bales slowed heat loss with millions of trapped air pockets. The dome shape prevented wind from hammering any one point, and the snow already layering thick across the curved roof added insulation no lumber cabin could match. Outside, life froze. Inside, the temperature didn't budge more than 3 degrees. It wasn't luck. It was design meeting reality. By the 6th day of the deep freeze, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Andrew kept checking them because he didn't trust what he was seeing. Outside, 41 X, inside, 30 degrees. A difference of 72 degrees without burning extra fuel, without stuffing cracks, without fighting drafts all night long. How is this even possible? He finally asked, not out of doubt anymore, but out of honest curiosity. Elias walked him through it in plain practical terms. First, the air gap, 12 inches of still air. Wind can't move it, so it holds heat, like a blanket no one sees. He tapped the inner wall. Second, the sod. Heavy, slow to freeze, slow to warm. That means it doesn't swing with outside weather. It resists change. Andrew nodded, touching the surface. It was cool, but not biting cold. Third, the grass bales. Light, but tight. Fibers trap heat. Millions of little pockets working together. And the snow, Andrew asked. That's the fourth layer, a gift. It seals the dome, adds insulation, blocks the wind even more. Then Elias added something Andrew didn't expect. Fifth, shape. A square lets wind push. A dome makes wind move. Big difference. None of it sounded like modern engineering language, but every piece lined up with what Andrew was watching in real time. The cabin wasn't warm because they were heating it well. It was warm because it wasn't losing the heat they already had. Other ranchers were burning through cords of wood and still waking up with ice on the inside of their walls. Their roofs shook. Their barns groaned. Their breath hung in the air like fog. In Elias's dome, the air stayed clear, dry, and steady. It didn't look modern. It didn't look impressive, but it was performing better than every proper cabin in the valley. By the time the storm reached its 9th day, people were running out of options. Ranchers who had mocked Elias at the start of winter were now dealing with cabins so cold they could barely keep water unfrozen. Some were burning twice the wood they had planned for the whole month. Others were trying to block drafts with blankets, feed bags, even saddle pads. Nothing worked. The cold found every weakness. That's when the first neighbor showed up. It was near dusk when a man named Carter Dawson pushed open the dome's heavy door flap and stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. The sudden change in temperature, the calmness of the space hit him harder than any words could have. "You're telling me this is without a stove running full time?" he asked finally. Elias nodded. "We use it when we cook, that's it." Carter let out a low whistle. "My place is 20 degrees colder, and I've had the fire going since before daylight." More neighbors came the next day, and the day after that. Some were embarrassed, some were curious, and some were simply desperate for any idea that could help them make it through the next 48 hours. They asked questions, walked the perimeter, pressed hands against the walls just like Andrew had. Most didn't understand the build. A few didn't care, they just wanted something that worked. One man admitted he'd lost 3 calves already. Elias didn't brag. He didn't preach. He just told them what he knew. Winter rewards whatever holds heat. This does. For the first time since he started building, no one laughed. The storm had done the convincing for him. When the storm finally broke on the 11th day, it didn't end with sunshine or relief. It ended with exhaustion. People stepped out of their cabins looking worn down and older than they had 2 weeks earlier. Horses shivered under thick coats of frost. Barn doors were frozen shut, and smoke from wood stoves hung low in the still, bitter air. But the real story came from the numbers: lost livestock, frozen wells, cabins that barely stayed above zero during the coldest nights. Word spread fast that Elias's dome had held steady while almost everyone else's place struggled. Soon conversations across the valley shifted from complaining about the winter to trying to understand what Elias had done differently and why it mattered. At the store in town, men gathered around the stove, rubbing cold hands and shaking their heads. "How does a dirt and grass hut beat a solid log cabin?" one asked. Another replied, "Maybe we've been building wrong for 30 years. A few resisted that idea. Pride is hard to set aside, especially when it means admitting the old man down the road who doesn't say much and doesn't follow the crowd might have solved a problem they didn't even know how to measure. But quietly, ranchers began asking themselves simple, honest questions. Why did his walls stay dry while ours iced over? Why did he burn a quarter of the wood we did? How did a structure that looked weak handle 70-mile-per-hour gusts without shifting? The biggest shift wasn't in their cabins. It was in their thinking. For the first time, the community realized something they had ignored for years. Modern doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means different, and sometimes the old ways survive because they still work. When the weather settled enough for real work to resume, Andrew found his father outside the dome early one morning, brushing frost off the outer wall. The sunrise was pale and cold, the kind that gives no warmth but sharpens everything you look at. Elias worked slowly, his breath forming steady clouds. He looked calm, tired, but calm. "Pa," Andrew said, "people are starting to ask how you figured all this out." Elias shrugged. "I didn't figure anything out. I remembered." He didn't mean it as poetry. He meant it literally. His father had taught him things that didn't come from books, lessons built from trial, error, and survival. Elias wasn't trying to be clever when he built the dome. He wasn't trying to stand out. He was trying to stay alive using the only tools that had ever truly proven themselves: observation, patience, and respect for what the land could teach. Andrew leaned against the wall beside him. "Most folks want a reason, something they can measure." Elias smiled faintly. "Cold doesn't care about reasons. Cold only cares about results." It was the most straightforward explanation he could give. People today trusted things that looked engineered: straight lines, sharp corners, heavy beams. But out here on the frontier, the truth was simpler. The land rewarded whatever worked. It didn't matter if the method was old, strange, or unpopular. What Elias understood, something his neighbors were just beginning to see, was that survival wasn't about pride or appearance. It was about choosing the design that lost the least heat, wasted the least effort, and demanded the least from a man when conditions turned deadly. And sometimes that design wasn't the newest one. Sometimes it was the one your grandfather built with his bare hands and never bothered to explain. Elias didn't need people to admire him. He just needed them to understand the lesson before winter came again. When spring finally pushed winter back, it didn't come gently. The thaw hit fast. Snow cracked and slumped off rooftops. Streams overflowed. Fences reappeared inch by inch, and ranchers surveyed the damage with heavy hearts. Everyone had lost something: sleep, livestock, money, confidence. It was a season people would talk about for years, usually with a long pause before they began. Except at Elias's place. His dome stood exactly as it had the day he finished it. Solid, dry, unchanged. No shifting, no cracking, no sagging roofline. The interior still smelled like grass and earth instead of smoke and damp wood. Andrew walked through it one afternoon, running his hand along the curve the same way he did in the coldest days of the winter. "This place shouldn't have worked as well as it did," he said quietly. Elias shook his head. "It worked because we stopped fighting the cold and started working with it." Word spread, slowly at first, then faster. A few ranchers rebuilt damaged cabins using a double wall system. Others asked Elias to walk them through the design. Some copied the dome shape exactly. A few modified it, added drainage, used stone, mixed sod with hay. But the principle remained: a structure that held heat by refusing to let wind steal it. Andrew wrote everything down: measurements, materials, the way frost formed the temperature patterns. Not because he wanted credit, but because he didn't want the knowledge disappearing again the way it nearly had. And as he worked, he realized something important. The real value of the dome wasn't in the shape or the materials. It was in the humility behind it. Elias had trusted the wisdom of people who survived winters tougher than anything modern Montana had seen. He didn't dismiss the old ways. He didn't chase new ideas because they were new. He chose what worked. That was the frontier lesson, simple, honest, and still true today. In a real winter survival isn't about what you build. It's about why you build it.